1981, a very formative year for what we know as hardcore today. When 1981 started, there was no term for that more aggressive sound that was coming out of California. Just some journalists were like, you know what, like this stuff is a little bit more hardcore than what's happening over there in the UK. But it never really caught on as the name of the subgenre. That would all change by the time 1981 came to a close. Hey ladies, how's it going? Dan Frampton here, and today we're gonna talk about Ground Zero, year number 1, the birth of hardcore, the year hardcore became hardcore. This is a very exciting video for me. So many great albums came out this year. So many of my favorite albums of all time are on this list. The records that came out in 1981 wouldn't just shape that decade, they would go on to shape and influence the culture, the scene as a whole, from pillar to post all across this great globe of ours. So the journalists were spouting off this word hardcore as like a descriptor, but it didn't really catch on until Joey Shithead got a hold of it. Up here in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, as you might have heard Nardwuar say once or twice, there was this little band called D.O.A. Now most people know D.O.A. as mostly the couch that people slept on when they toured from California. But they were a great band in their own right. Not necessarily a hardcore band. D.O.A. was more of that straight up punk rock. They had their own little spin on it, but they were like crude punks that found belches and farts funny. That's D.O.A. But Joey Shithead is a very influential figure in the scene, and particularly up north. So in 1981, when he started hearing that term hardcore, he wanted to make it official. So he named D.O.A.'s record that year Hardcore 81. A lot of people seem to have the misconception that Joey Shithead named the genre, but that's not the case. He was just as excited about that sound that was coming out of California, even though that wasn't necessarily what they were doing. He was so excited about it, in fact, that he wanted to document it on his record. And in doing so, he cemented himself in the legacy, in the history of this rich, great culture. But D.O.A. Hardcore 81 really isn't the best record of all time. I'm just gonna set it right here in the B tier. This next record that I'm about to talk about is probably my favorite record of all time. I think that Minor Threat, the first 2 7-inches, are the best set of tracks ever put to tape. It's like the perfect attitude of anti-authority and positive clean living. I love the message. I love the sound. It is just fire from front to back. I love this thing. I love the length of the songs. I love how hard they hit. I love how fast they are. I love the riffs. I love the bass lines. Everything about the attitude and just the presentation of Minor Threat by Minor Threat is absolutely incredible. I don't need to say any more than that. S tier. I don't need to say any more than that, but I'm going to say more than that. Straight edge didn't really have its own movement at the time that this record came out, and doing things DIY wasn't really the norm. Bands were still trying to get booked in clubs, you know, the CBGBs and the Whiskeys of the world. Clubs, but Ian MacKaye had a completely different vision. That vision did include the X's that were put on the hands of the underage people going to these clubs, and he would adopt that as a symbol for straight edge. Clean living as a message to counterbalance all the drunk heroin addicts that came before him. It was the right message at the right time, and it was a line in the sand saying, nah, we're not that old kind of punk, we're a new kind of thing. And still to this day, this record is mimicked and mocked and worshipped. This thing is just like top of the top. Ian MacKaye is so staunchly dedicated to his values and his beliefs that he will not even appear in a magazine that has a beer ad in it. That's why you'll never see this record in like Rolling Stone or whatever. But Nike did something cheeky a couple years ago where they took this album cover and instead of where it says Minor Threat, they just called it Major Threat. Turned it blue, put a pair of like Jordans on them, and it was like, this is our advertising now. And Minor Threat and Ian MacKaye weren't really so chill about that, basically because of what Nike represents. They're the corporate overlords. And that's just the antithesis of everything that Minor Threat was. They only existed for a couple short years, but goddamn, the tracks that they laid down in those couple short years are influential and will be talked about until the end of time. Okay, so we've been through Canada so far, we've been through DC, but that isn't where it was all going down. All this hardcore stuff was happening in California And the first band I want to talk about is Adolescents. Their debut LP is a self-titled, but it's also known as the Blue Album because of how it looks. Without this album, I'm not sure that there's a Descendants after them, you know? And if there's no Descendants, I don't know if there's any pop punk or skate punk. Melodic hardcore might be totally fucked in the water if it wasn't for this Adolescents record. The songs on this are still being licensed in like video games and stuff. You'll probably know that Amoeba song from the Tony Hawk soundtrack. Amoeba. That one, you know. Anyway, S tier. Keeping it in California, we're gonna talk about this band X and their sophomore record, Wild Gift. Now this Wild Gift record is totally a punk rock record, but in my eyes, and with hindsight as my benefit, this album kind of reads more of like an indie rock album. And that's all pretty good, that's all pretty dandy. The performances are otherworldly, the vocals are awesome, the songwriting is insane. It certainly gets lumped in with all those bands that were doing things at this time that really shaped hardcore and punk from this point forward, but I don't really see it as a hardcore record. And that might be a little bit controversial, but the way that they blend R&B, country, the blues in this really special way is very spectacular, and I can't put it any lower than an A tier. True Sounds of Liberty, T.S.O.L. Very interesting band name. I would say not a great band name. I would say actually an awful band name. But they changed their style in 1981 because they used to be this kind of leftist, aggressive, hardcore band. And when they changed their style, they didn't do what anyone expected. They went horror punk. They started singing about necrophilia and all sorts of weird horror film type tropes or whatever. And because they took themselves so far out of reality, it's corny, okay? It's just corny as hell. And their careers kind of run parallel with the Misfits, but the Misfits just did it in a more captivating way. I will say, TSOL are much better musicians, are much better songwriters than the Misfits ever could dream of being. But what the Misfits did was they knew what image did. They knew what branding and marketing were, and they used their strengths to make just millions and millions of dollars. Their logo, their name, everything about Misfits just screams horror brand. But TSOL, that's a clunky branding. This album cover, this is a total mess. No one's gonna buy this. I can't really say that I like it more than Misfits stuff. It's a completely different thing. But this record, Dance With Me, is certainly an A tier record. Sorry, Ma, I forgot to take out the trash. Was the 1981 album by The Replacements. Now, The Replacements were very varied on this record. They were bouncing all over the place. They wanted to show that they could do all sorts of different styles, all while maintaining that kind of like punk rock DIY aesthetic. They weren't lumped in with these California bands. These guys were kind of more of a Minnesota type band. And they would go on to be more of an indie group after this. But I see this record as a hardcore record. It's kind of in the same vein as that X record where they're kind of doing different genres or whatever, but they're just doing it with a little bit more attitude and a little bit more like piss and vinegar, you know? So even though I do like it slightly more than that X record, it's still in the same tier, but just a little bit higher. All right, so we spent a little time there in Minnesota. We did some ice fishing, you know, out there on the lake, but now it's time to go back all the way down to California and talk about Wasted Youth. The talent in this group is insane. What a tight record this is. Reagan's in. A very political affair. Now on this record, we get some pretty classic punk rock vibes, but it's just cranked up to 1,000,000. I noticed that the track list was different from the internet and Spotify, and upon closer inspection I realized that on Spotify they just flipped the A-side and the B-side, so I got this kind of backwards listening experience going on. So I know the record kind of in two forms, and actually B-side first is the better form. So the artwork here is like Reagan's face, right? But that wasn't the original artwork. The original artwork was Charles Manson's face, but the band changed it last minute without even telling the artist. Minor Threat was promoting this positive, clean lifestyle, but on this record, I feel the heroin and I taste the hard-boiled eggs. My back hurts from sleeping on the floor. It's a pretty great record. It's tight as fuck. It goes so hard, and the members from this band would go on to do bigger and better things. I'm gonna plop that right down here in the A tier. Okay, we got a couple records here, and as you're seeing, the A tier is getting pretty dang stacked. This is Agent Orange, Living in Darkness. You want to talk about influencing skate punk. You want to talk about influencing pop punk. Agent Orange. My God, the sync licenses these guys are still getting to this day is amazing. Off an 8-song record. Unbelievable. This stuff is incredible. And I'm being a little bit hyperbolic because you know I'm putting it up here in the S tier, but I still like that Adolescents and Minor Threat record more. If I'm being honest with you. Now next up is one of my favorite bands from the era. We're going to be talking about Minutemen. And in 1981, they didn't really put out my favorite Minutemen record, but what they did was put out The Punchline. So punk bands aren't really famous for having tons of money, and that was definitely the case for the Minutemen over here. And they still wanted to record this album, okay? They had 15 songs, and it was important that they got them out. And even though these 15 songs only ran 18 minutes, they had to find the most economical way to get this shit done. So what they did was they booked some studio time late into the night because those late night hours were cheaper. They used tape that was already used before and just taped over it. They did one live take, front to back, no overdubs. And then after the evening was done, they just did this and called it a record. And I just love that approach to writing a record. That's my favorite way of doing it, even though you don't get the best work out of it, okay? There's no way you're gonna get the best work out of it. And that's very clear on this thing. It breaks my heart to put them so low, but Minutemen, you gotta wallow down there in the depths of the B tier. Okay, we got one more record to list. If you're familiar with the genre, I'm sure you know what record this is. This happens to be one of the most influential punk rock or hardcore records kind of all time. But that wasn't really the case when it came out. When Damaged by Black Flag hit the shelves, people ignored it. People hated it. People didn't want to be a part of what this record was giving you. And I can kind of understand why. I mean, the performances are kind of sloppy, the songwriting is not really the greatest, but as an overall piece of work, this thing is monumental. And it kind of hurts me to say how great this record is because I don't like Henry Rollins. I think Henry Rollins is kind of a shit face, but this record is kind of fire front to back. They had a vision and they worked so hard to bring that vision to life. And there's so many like stories and mysteries about this record. Because if you're familiar with Black Flag, you know that Henry Rollins is their third singer and this is their first record. So those numbers alone just tell you that there's a little bit of a story there. And apparently, with Keith and Ron Reyes from beforehand, they were an okay band, but they were missing that last element to truly make them one of the best bands of all time. Because when Henry Rollins came in, that was like their final form. And as the legend goes, this record was recorded in full first with Dez on vocals. But they didn't like the way that it sounded, so they used that record as reference for Henry Rollins to then put his tracks to. But again, that's all hearsay, that's all legend. Apparently those tracks exist out there in the world and they were on the tape trading circuits or whatever. But as far as we're concerned, these tracks have only ever been performed by Henry Rollins himself. Now, if I haven't overhyped this record enough, it's clear that it's going up here in the S tier. And depending on what kind of fan you are, you might have it right here at the top of the S tier because of how influential this thing was. But to me, because of how petty and spiteful I am and how much I don't like Henry Rollins, I'm putting it here at the very bottom of the S tier. So that's 1981. It looks pretty great. I mean, not one bad record on this whole list. I was just gonna shuffle around these records so they were in the right order from best to worst, but when I looked at it, I was like, yeah, no, that's basically it. That's exactly how I feel. Oh, well, I hope I didn't upset you with my opinions on that one. Please let me know what you think down below. Like, comment, and subscribe. And until my next upload, you know what to do. Watch another upload.